Jewish presence, the Jewish kingdom once again was traumatic to them. One thing I can say is that if we look at this tangible reality that it's not great stress for people to just have an independent government in their own land. It's something that people feel, especially in surrounding nations, feel must be terminated at all costs. And this is something that we're in the modern system just have to this today. I mean, it should be a bill that should have done. So you for the
Rabbi Grossman, your connection is really bad.
Okay, how is it now? Any better?
Yes.
Okay. My phone is very sensitive, and somehow when I have to hold it exactly the right angle. So if it happens again, just let me know, and I'll adjust the handset. So the Gemara mentions that there were a number of different possible ways. Like all prophecies, they're delivered in a way that's ambiguous, so that after the fact you can look back and say, "Oh, that's what it means," but that doesn't really enable you to figure out the future in advance, because that would kind of defeat the purpose. So the prophecy was 70 years, but there were many different ways that you could calculate 70 years from what. There were like all historical events. It happened in many stages. The destruction, was it the destruction of the temple? Was it the first wave of exile? Was it the second wave of exile? So there were different calculations. The Babylonians made one calculation, and they celebrated what they thought was the end of the 70 years, where they figured the threat from the Jews is no longer an active concern. But we know how that worked out. During that party, they had the handwriting on the wall, and the Babylonian Empire ended that night. Ahasuerus had his own calculation for the 70 years, and he thought that his was more accurate. And again, it seems, from reading the commentaries, the Midrash and the Talmud, it seems that these monarchs were obsessed with the Jews, with the prophecies of the Jews. It describes Haman's conversations with Ahasuerus. He attempts to convince him to destroy the Jews, and the fear that it had to be overcome because of the knowledge that these people had of how Hashem has dealt with the enemies of the Jews until now. And it was a very real concern to them. So the concept that the anti-Semites tried to put forth was that God is either old and powerless, or perhaps powerless in this context. Perhaps he can do certain things, but he can't do others. But these were pagans; they were not unbelievers. And again, to Western ears, so some of these things say, well, kings are really concerned with politics and economics and power, but to these people, these spiritual realities and the history were very real and tangible concerns. And the truth is that if you look at the obsessions that the anti-Semites have until today, even Adolf Hitler, when his name be blotted out, he wrote that there's only one true struggle, that's between us and the Jews, and everything else. That's really what it's all about. And it's something which, if we didn't see it with our own eyes, if we haven't observed these things in our own lifetimes, it'd be hard to imagine. Why would people be so obsessed with this one nation? The Jews at this point were powerless. Their empire was destroyed. They were exiled. They were subjugated. Why did it matter? Why did Ahasuerus celebrate that the 70 years were up and the Jews hadn't gone back to Israel? Why did Haman want to exterminate the Jews? But the people were obsessed with the Jews. And again, it's almost hard to understand it, except that we don't need to. We see it with our own eyes. We see it today. Turn on any radio, open any newspaper, everybody's obsessed with the Jews. And it was true back then as well. So the king makes this party, and at this party, things start to happen. And right away, things start to happen. And at first, if we had been reading the story for the first time, we would have no idea what was going on. all of a sudden, he's been king for 3 years, and now all of a sudden he's executing his wife. What for? Again, if you knew the backstory, you would know. We're told the Russian Vashti was an anti-Semite. Vashti used to torment the Jewish girls on the Shabbos. She would make them work for her without clothing on the Shabbos. And lo and behold, we're told that Vashti was summoned on the seventh day to appear at the party of the king without any clothes on, to show off her beauty. This was Vashti's. It was simple justice to Vashti that on the seventh day, which happened to be Shabbos, was summoned to appear without any clothes for the king. And when she was executed. So Vashti got what she deserved, but the king too wasn't blameless, and that's why God put her into the king to make something. Again, as powerful as he is, he's really powerless. He's subject to whatever fate is decreed for him, and what's decreed for him is he's going to suffer the loss of his queen because of his own wickedness. And what's more obvious, and I guess more central to the story, seemingly, is that this paves the way for the new queen to come in, and that is Esther. And there are less obvious aspects as well. Seemingly a side note to this incident is that the king sends out a directive to all of the countries saying that every man should be the master of his house and should speak in his native tongue. Talmud says this, I think maybe we mentioned it last week, this saved the Jewish people. That's why we're here today. And again, something that's so relatable. The legislative actions in the governing body of the Persian empires. What could be seemingly more unimportant and irrelevant to our history? And yet, this was a life-saving event that had a pivotal role in the story. Why? Because this directive that basically, I had an issue with my wife, and now every man has to know that you got to be master of your own house. And everyone said, "That's a law. That's a king." This is what they're sending out. Like today would probably be a tweet. The king would send out a tweet. Everyone said, "This king is off his rocker." So many years later, the story picks up speed, and we're told that the king promulgated genocide against the Jews. Everyone should kill the Jews. Everyone said, well, let's not jump the gun. Let's wait and see how this plays out. We've gotten communications from the king before, and they didn't rush to carry out what they were being commanded. And it's only because the king had a track record of saying bizarre things. So, this seemingly irrelevant footnote to history had a key role in the story. And the Megillah is full of incidents like that. At the same time, this party, so again, it creates justice for Vashti and for King Ahasuerus. It also serves, we're told, again, in different midrash and different opinions, the person who speaks up and gives the advice to the king to eliminate the queen because of her kind of poor performance as a wife is Memuchan. Some say Memuchan was Haman, none other than Haman. And some say that Haman himself had similar issues in his own background with his own wife, Zeresh, who we meet later in the story. So really, this would be an expression of Haman's own personal frustrations, his own insecurities in his marriage being projected onto the king. And lo and behold, a junior minister, not the most prominent of the ministers, and he offers advice that is essentially, from his own personal experience, really not good advice at all. And we're told that the king and all the ministers approved, but they didn't like the idea. Again, the wisest and the most capable, the most powerful people in the land, Hashem plays them like puppets, and they all agree to something which is really foolish. And and everybody loses as a result. So, Vashti gets killed, the king loses his wife, they send out a bizarre decree to all the nations. Everyone thinks it's a good idea at the time. Why? Because Hashem wanted it to happen. We're also told that Memuchan, later Haman, is elevated, but deep down inside, the king has a resentment towards Haman because ultimately it was Haman's advice that resulted in the destruction of the king's first queen. Again, everything is recorded and it comes out later in the story. An additional to the
this is in one version. This was also the problem that resulted in the leader to the story. The king, aside from celebrating the end of the 7-year exile, which was bad enough, that should have been enough for the Jews to stay away. The king actively invited everyone to come to the party, including the Jews, and many of the Jews felt that they needed to come. But it's bad enough that they came to this party, which was, celebrating essentially their own destruction as a people. And this participation in this event was seen as a national failing, and it led to the threat to Jewish survival that materialized later in the story. But none of that was obvious at the time. The party proceeded. Again, we only know this in hindsight. The only things that happened, we were on the ground and experiencing the events in real time. The king makes a party and everyone has a good time. The only problem is that the queen ends up dead. We're told that the king now goes through the necessary steps to find a new queen, and he selects Esther. The whole procedure for finding a new queen is suitable for the kinds of characters that we're dealing with. It's like a enormous beauty contest, and it's distasteful and unsavory to say the least. And what's completely incomprehensible, and really remains kind of incomprehensible throughout the story, is that Esther becomes a subject of the one person who would have wanted the least to be in the position of being queen. Now the Talmud says that again in Critique of Achashverosh, nobody wanted to send their daughters to this beauty contest because they spent one night with the king and the rest of their life in the harem. Who wanted that? Even the lucky one who got to be queen, maybe that's something that a lot of people would have competed for if they thought they had a chance. Esther certainly did not want it under any circumstances. First of all, she was Jewish. Why would she want to be queen of such a person? Second of all, the rabbis tell us that Mordechai, her uncle, who raised her when she was an orphan, also eventually married her, which means she was a married woman. And yet, she's taken to the queen of Achashverosh. And that's one of the, again, inexplicable aspects of the story. I imagine there are discussions of this, but, there's no obvious resolution to that. Esther was a prophetess. She's one of the, I believe, 7 women in Scripture who have prophecy. There's a number of men and a number of women. It says that there were many millions of prophets in our history, but only a handful of them that were recorded with prophetic messages that are part of Scripture for us to read today, and Esther is one of them. And by all accounts, she's the heroine of the story, and she's in the most spiritually compromised position. Why would God do this to her? And there's no overt answer that's given in the Megillah. That itself, I think, is something which, and it's part of the hidden aspect of the Megillah, where God is truly hidden, where a great and righteous person ends up being married. Again, according to a married woman ends up married to a someone who's described as being wicked from beginning to end, and that's her life. And yet, it's not her fault, and she's put there for a heroic role, and she goes down in history as one of our heroines. But in her personal life, she suffered clearly a great deal, and of course there was a reason, but the reason is not part of the story. I guess it was part of her story, not part of our story, and it's easy to forget that when we read the story. In a way, that's very poignant, and for all of us, I think this is something to pause and think about, because the Megillah is, the holiday of Purim is largely about the happy ending, right? We talk about the turnaround and how the Jews went from darkness to a great light, from being slated for extermination to becoming admired throughout the land. And, eventually, although not in the Megillah itself, but eventually they returned to Israel, built the second temple. Mordechai is second to the king. Esther is the queen. But for Esther, it was really a tragedy. Esther presumably was conscious. She understood. The rabbis tell us. She and Mordechai wrote the Megillah.
They sent it to the rabbis for approval. They asked the rabbis to decree a holiday. The rabbis did that. It's one of only two holidays we have that are rabbinic in nature. With Purim and Hanukkah, Hanukkah hadn't happened yet at this time, so it was the first rabbinic holiday. They said the Megillah itself says that the memory of these events will never depart from the Jews for all generations. And it says, I don't understand exactly what this means, but it says that even in the days of Mashiach and the final redemption, all holidays will be forgotten except for Purim. I don't know. They don't ask me to explain that, but it tells you something about the significance of this day. So Esther undoubtedly was aware that she had done a great thing and that she had a great role in history, but it didn't make her personal life any easier. So what's the explanation? I don't know. So, in our own lives, and how many people, sometimes it's easier to zoom out and look at other lives. I think about it sometimes in terms of our recent history. Well, you can think about it at any time. How many good people, fine people, religious people, Torah scholars came to this country 100 years ago or more, and they came with faith and they came with knowledge, and they were escaping situations that were unbearable, and they came to this country, and then it was a land of opportunity, and it was the golden land, but it was also the land of non-kosher. It was a land where you couldn't keep Shabbos and hold down a job, and there were many people who either came in ready to embrace the new world, come what may, and other people who tried to hold on to the old world, but they found that they couldn't resist the pressures. And then there were people who stayed strong and stuck with what they had brought from the old world, but their children did not continue. And they say in some cases, that was attributed, Rav Moshe Feinstein said this, that the parents who said it's it's difficult to be Jewish. And maybe they did stick with it, but the pressure was so enormous and the situation was so dark that the children didn't continue because they saw the unhappiness that became associated in their mind with Judaism. They saw what a hard time their parents had. And you think of, and then there were those who, against all odds, did manage to succeed and somehow not only stuck with it, but planted the seeds and somehow managed to pass it on. And today we have vibrant community, we have yeshivas and shuls, but you think about all the what ifs, people who had so much to offer and who had so much faith and so much passion, and maybe did everything that they could, and maybe were not to be blamed at all, and wanted to hold on to the Torah and mitzvahs, but they were so compromised because they had to work, how many hours per day, or they just couldn't pass it on to their children despite their best efforts, and maybe they really tried. Maybe they can't be blamed. And at the end of the day, we don't know the answer to every question. I'm sure Esther would have wanted to be anywhere but the palace of Ahasuerus. And I'm sure she could have done a lot of mitzvahs if she had been anywhere else in the Jewish community, surrounded by Jewish people, could have built a family with Mordechai, and she couldn't do it. Is Esther a figure of any less in our history? Does she go down in history as being any less of a person? Absolutely not. Nobody thinks of Esther as in any way, what better mission could Esther have done? She saved the Jews. And yet, if you look at her circumstances, her actual life that she led, it looks very dark. And you say, why would God do that? The answer is, we don't know. I don't know. So this is true at any time. How many rabbis had a house full of manuscripts that were destroyed in a pogrom or in a fire, and we'll never know what they labored for years to produce. Or people that unsung, people who did mitzvahs or tried to do mitzvahs and put in their best effort, and after everything that was done, they weren't given the opportunity to fulfill everything they wanted to do. I remember hearing once that that's the concept, one of the 13 principles of faith that we have. We believe in one God, believe in Torah, we believe in the world to come, and many different things. We believe in Mashiach, the most widely quoted, And also we believe in the resurrection of the dead. What is the concept of resurrection? So there's different ways but to say it, but one of the, I guess, kind of key points is that we were created and placed in this world, and it was a perfect world, and it was a perfect creation. That's the big, by definition, God is perfect. What He creates is perfect. And the very first story that happened is man and woman failed to live up to the expectations and what they're commanded to do. And the very first day they eat from the forbidden tree, and they're driven out of the Garden of Eden. And ever after, so death becomes a part of human existence, and imperfection and failure, and things all go downhill from there. Again, there's an arc of history. Ultimately, everything has to be rectified. It has to reach the fulfillment of what God initially planned. But once man sinned, imperfection entered human existence. The body is corrupted, and you can't, our body is no longer the pure and holy thing that it was when it was first created. And therefore, we can't reach perfection. We can strive for perfection despite our bodies. We can try to overcome and master and control the desires of the body, but ultimately the body is a weight that kind of drags us down and holds us back from reaching perfection. And death is the body being deconstructed, taken back to atoms. The resurrection is the body put back together in its most perfect form. And the idea is that people who really tried their best and really wanted to be everything that a human being was designed to be, and in their actual lives, they were compromised. They couldn't do it. And all of us are like that to some extent, even when we live in America, and even when we're, our health and our finances and everything is okay, but it's really not, because there are so many things that society prevents us from reaching our potential in so many ways that are even our personalities, our human weaknesses, and certainly if you look back at history at the much darker times than today, and people who really did everything they could, and there was so much that they just were unable, based on circumstances, to do. And the idea that there'll be another round, that Hashem will give us the opportunity to be what we were designed to be, with a soul that's complete and a body that's complete, that both can work together for spirituality, that's a key factor, because it tells us that the perfection of God's goodness is not lost. That God does not place us in a dark and broken world. That He does, but that's not the end of it. That's just a temporary way station. We believe in the world to come, which is the key factor. But it's not just that there's a world to come, but even in this world, there's another phase, another state of existence that we'll get to experience, and the ability to be what we were designed to be. And that's the story of Esther. And perhaps one thing to end with, at the very end of the Megillah, it says that Mordechai had a second in command to the king, and accepted by most of his brothers, great in the eyes of the Jews, and seeking the good of his people and peace for all of his descendants. So it's kind of a strange statement, accepted by most of his brethren, and the rabbis pick up on this and they say there was an element of, dissatisfaction, or Mordechai was a bit downgraded in the eyes of some of his peers. There's a scriptural source for that, and the reason was that he got involved in matters of state, as we know, and less involved in Torah study in a full-time way as he had previously been. He had been, a Torah scholar, one of the members of the Sanhedrin, a leading rabbi at the time, and he was more involved in other things, and for that reason, he went down a notch in the esteem that he was held. So, kind of a strange thing to say. It's almost an implication that there was some critique of Mordechai. The takeaway, according to the rabbis, is that studying Torah is greater than saving lives. Now, that statement itself is a very powerful one, and pause and reflect on it a little bit. It's very counterintuitive. Obviously, if you're studying Torah and see someone drowning, you jump up and jump into the river and save them. There's not a question about that. It overrides just about any mitzvah. So that's not what it means when we say studying Torah is greater than saving lives. What it means is, there was a story that illustrates this. I believe it was the author of Slobodka. A student came into the yeshiva one day, and he was very, I guess, proud, or at the very least, very enthusiastically related how he had been on his way, and he saw somebody, maybe drowning in the river or whatever it was. He managed to save a life, and I told him, you unfortunately didn't have the privilege of studying Torah. That you had to do this other mitzvah instead. The point of the story was that, again, the message here is not that he did the wrong thing, obviously, or that he should feel bad, but he wanted to, I think the idea was that he sensed from the student almost like, unlike every other day when he had a boring, or I wouldn't say boring, but kind of an ordinary mitzvah of studying Torah. This was a special mitzvah, an opportunity to save a life, and that's really incorrect. It is certainly the right thing to do under the circumstances, but we have to understand that Torah is the most powerful mitzvah. There's nothing more special in studying Torah. Obviously, there are priorities, right? When it's time to shake a lulav, you shake a lulav. When it's time to hear the Megillah, you hear the Megillah. But Torah study is the most powerful mitzvah, and you do what you have to do. But again, sometimes we feel that people who are saving lives are doing a more important thing than those who are studying Torah. It's the other way around. Studying Torah is the most important thing.
Susie, Rabbi, please?
Yes.
Susie, please? But
yes.
I thought, isn't it that Torah study is saving lives? Like,
well, that's true also. The Chavetz Chaim said that. I think there's
an example, yeah?
Yeah, there's a story like that with the Chavetz Chaim where there was, I think, money was being raised.
I know that's the beds, right.
To make a hospital. And
right.
The punchline essentially was, well, the yeshiva students ensure that you don't need to use as many hospital beds because they're studying Torah. That was the punchline of the story.
Right.
So that is true, but that may be correct. But again, it's like saying you give tzedakah because God will give the money back to you. You won't lose, which is true. That's not why you give tzedakah. That's just it's a corollary. So you shouldn't feel that if you study Torah, you're drawing resources off those who save lives, because studying Torah saves more lives. But that we don't need that. The fact that the rabbis tell us Torah study is the greatest mitzvah is enough. That's just a fact. Torah study is the greatest mitzvah. Period.
Okay.
So we have to know that and understand that. So again, the question is, what impact does it have on our lives? Again, if you have to save a life, you have to save a life, and there's no question. You close your book and you go save a life. So is it just academic to know Torah study is greater? And the question is highlighted in the case of Mordechai, because again, clearly he did the right thing, presumably, right? I mean, he was one of the heroes of the Megillah, and if you're not criticizing him for studying Torah, for saving lives because of what he needed to do. So what is the meaning of saying that he was downgraded or held in less esteem? So this I heard in the name of my Rabbi. So he said there was actually a somewhat early source which says that what it means is Mordechai did the right thing, but nevertheless his spiritual standing suffered because, again, for circumstances like Esther, for circumstances beyond his control, he wasn't able to be involved in Torah study, and therefore he wasn't held in the same esteem. And my Rebbe did not agree with that position. He said, you don't lose by doing the right thing, and it doesn't hold water to say that Mordechai did what was expected of him to the ultimate degree and still somehow suffered a loss of esteem in the eyes of his peers. So he explained it differently, and he said, and this is why it's important, he said, look, we're told, King David said, he practiced in the Tehillim, I calculated my pathways, and I turned my feet to go study your commandments. The Midrash says that King David said the following: every day I make an itinerary and I calculate what I need to do. And then I find my feet carrying me off to go study Torah. So what does that mean? King David is a king, and he loves to study Torah. Those are given. He makes a calculation of what he needs to do because, like Mordechai, he has affairs of state, life-saving things, and he needs to do them. So then his feet carrying him off to study Torah, why is that the right thing? doesn't sound right. At the very least, he should be consistent. And if he makes an itinerary, he should stick to it. And if he thinks studying Torah is more important, he shouldn't have made the itinerary in the first place. It happen every day. Every day he makes a schedule and doesn't stick to it. That just sounds inconsistent. So what is he trying to say? So what Rabbi explains is that we think we know this from our own lives. We think it's a weakness, but it's actually an essential part of human nature. That we make decisions, but not with our head, or not so much with our head. A lot of it is with our instincts, with our hearts, with our stomachs, our hands and our feet, and they carry us to different places. So we say, yeah, I'm not going to eat that piece of cake. And before I walk into the room, I'm going to impress upon myself, I'm not going to eat a piece of cake. And I walk into the room and I sit down and I eat the piece of cake. So what happened? Am I inconsistent? Am I weak-willed? I'm neither of the above. I just wasn't realistic. I understood that my mind knew I shouldn't eat the piece of cake, but I simply underestimated how little of an impact my mind has on my decision. Once I got into the room, my stomach got involved, my appetites were awakened, and those are more powerful than my mental decision. So I was simply unaware. The problem is that we fall into the same trap again and again, and we forget that this happens. But it's very understandable, because we'll act one way when our brain is analyzing the data, and we act completely differently when our appetites, our hormones, our emotions, our character traits are engaged. And we don't realize that we become completely different in this situation. And it's not a human weakness, it's the way humans are designed. It can actually be an asset if we, like everything else, we have to use the tools that are given to us and channel them in the right way. So what King David said was the following. He said, I also had appetites and desires and emotions. My appetites and desires were for Torah study. Just like the person who says, I won't eat the cake, and they see the cake on the platter and they eat the cake. To me, I said, I can't study Torah tomorrow. I have to do X, Y, and Z. And then tomorrow came, and I felt the pull of the Torah, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to study Torah. They say, well, why is that a good thing? It means he's being irresponsible. And the answer is that he's not, because, when it comes to cake, it's kind of irresponsible because, there's no logic there. It's simply that I want the cake, so I eat it. But with the Torah study, King David wants to study Torah so badly that he says, let me think it through one more time. And then it occurs to me, you know what, if I move that meeting from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and I do it together with the other meeting, and then I conference call them in the car, I can actually do both, and I can push that one off till Tuesday. So he suddenly finds doors opening in his mind and avenues he hadn't thought of before. And he's not going to do anything that's really irresponsible. I mean, if people are going to, are dying somewhere, he's not going to say, I'm going to study Torah. But the pull of his feet, instinct to go study Torah, suddenly creates a different picture. And what seemed like an absolute necessity last night, maybe I can push it up by another half an hour. And he somehow squeezes in the time and manages to do it. So now we come back to Mordechai, we can understand what the Megillah is telling us according to this version. Saying Mordechai was great, Mordechai was the hero. And Mordechai wrote the Megillah, so obviously he wouldn't write anything too bad.